War is often a grim affair, but some chapters are darker than others, especially regarding civilian suffering. Amid the chaos and bloodshed of the Vietnam War, a horrifying truth remains buried under decades of silence: the brutal torture of Vietnamese women at the hands of U.S. soldiers. These were not just isolated incidents of violence or collateral damage, they were deliberate acts of cruelty, where women were targeted for physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. But why did this happen? And how have these atrocities been hidden or downplayed for so long? Stay tuned, because what you're about to witness is both disturbing and heartbreaking. The Vietnam War had devastating consequences for all involved, but the suffering of Vietnamese women at the hands of U.S. soldiers was uniquely horrific. Women, many of them young and from rural villages, faced atrocities that no one should ever endure. These women were subjected to beatings, sexual violence, and psychological torment, often in front of their families or communities. For many, the trauma didn't end with the abuse itself. It lingered for years, leaving deep psychological scars. One particularly harrowing testimony comes from Tran Thai Uyet, who was only 17 when her village was raided by U.S. troops. She and several other women were rounded up, tied to trees, and subjected to hours of torture, including physical beatings and sexual assault. The soldiers showed no mercy, and the young women were left broken, physically and emotionally. Uyet describes the unimaginable pain, not just from the abuse itself, but from the shame and stigma that followed. In her community, being a victim of sexual violence was often seen as dishonorable, leading many survivors to live in silence for decades. The emotional weight of these stories is overwhelming. It's not just about the physical pain these women endured, it's the emotional and psychological toll that continues to haunt them to this day. Many survivors have struggled with PTSD, depression, and societal rejection. Some never spoke of their experiences, while others, like Uyet, bravely came forward in hopes that their stories would be told. But what could drive ordinary men, soldiers from a democratic nation like the United States, to commit such heinous acts? Were they acting on orders, or were they taking advantage of the lawlessness and chaos of war? The question of why this happened remains central. You see, propaganda during the war often painted the Vietnamese people, including women, as the enemy. Soldiers were conditioned to see the local population not as civilians, but as part of the communist threat. This dehumanization made it easier for them to justify their horrific actions. But that's only part of the answer. War itself has a brutalizing effect, stripping away the humanity of those involved. The soldiers who committed these atrocities were often young, inexperienced, and thrown into a conflict they didn't fully understand. The psychological strain of war, combined with fear, frustration, and anger, pushed some to commit unspeakable acts. But what about their leaders? Where were the commanders, the military officials who were supposed to enforce the rules of war? Well, the truth is, in many cases, military leaders turned a blind eye to the abuses. Some even encouraged aggressive tactics, believing that terrorizing the local population would weaken the enemy's resolve. In other instances, reports of torture and abuse were covered up, ensuring that those responsible faced little to no punishment. The brutality inflicted upon Vietnamese women was not limited to a few isolated incidents. It was part of a larger disturbing pattern. One of the most notorious examples of this cruelty was the My Lai massacre, which took place on March the 16th of 1968. During this horrific event, U.S. soldiers from Charlie Company, under the command of Lieutenant William Cawley, killed over 500 unarmed civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Many of the women were raped before being murdered. The massacre is often cited as one of the most egregious examples of war crimes committed by U.S. forces in Vietnam. What makes My Lai particularly horrifying is that it wasn't an anomaly. Reports from other villages reveal similar patterns of violence, where women were systematically tortured, raped, and murdered. These incidents were often driven by a combination of fear, frustration, and dehumanization. Soldiers were told that the Viet Cong could be hiding anywhere, and the line between combatants and civilians blurred. In this environment, women were seen as potential threats, but also as easy targets for soldiers, venting their rage and fear. The military culture at the time contributed to this violence. There was a pervasive sense of impunity among soldiers, fueled by a lack of accountability from higher-ups. When abuses were reported, they were often dismissed or covered up. This allowed a culture of violence to flourish, where the brutal treatment of civilians, particularly women, became normalized. In some cases, soldiers even took trophies such as photographs or personal items from their victims, further dehumanizing the women they tortured. As we move forward, it's important to understand the broader context of these abuses. They weren't isolated incidents committed by a few bad apples. They were part of a larger pattern of violence that characterized much of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. You see, the torture and abuse of these women remain a deeply controversial topic. Some argue that these acts were the result of a few rogue soldiers who lost control in the heat of battle, while others contend that they were symptomatic of a much larger problem within the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. The debate over responsibility and accountability is ongoing, with many questioning how such atrocities could occur under the watch of military leadership. On one side of the debate, there are those who believe that the violence committed by U.S. soldiers was an inevitable consequence of the war. The Vietnam War was a deeply traumatic and confusing conflict, where soldiers were often unsure of who the enemy was. In such an environment, it's argued that some soldiers simply snapped, unable to cope with the stress and fear of constant combat. The dehumanization of the Vietnamese people, coupled with the brutal conditions of war, led some to commit acts of violence they may have never imagined before entering the conflict. However, others argue that this explanation is too simplistic and ignores the systemic issues that contributed to these atrocities. Critics point to the military's failure to properly train soldiers on how to interact with civilians, as well as a culture of impunity that allowed such crimes to go unpunished. In many cases, soldiers who committed acts of torture and rape faced little to no consequences, leading some to believe that the military leadership either condoned or turned a blind eye to these abuses. The infamous body count mentality, where success was measured by the number of enemy dead, also played a role in encouraging violence against civilians. The My Lai massacre, for example, sparked widespread outrage when it was revealed to the public, but the response in the military was tepid at best. While Lieutenant Calley was initially convicted of murder, his sentence was later reduced, and he spent only a few years under house arrest. Many saw this as a gross miscarriage of justice, a symbol of the military's unwillingness to hold its own accountable for war crimes. It's easy to get lost in the complexity of war and military operations, but the core truth of this story is simple. The brutal torture of Vietnamese women was an inexcusable violation of human rights. The women who suffered during the war were not combatants or enemies. They were civilians, mothers, daughters, and sisters, caught in the crossfire of a conflict they had no part in starting. Many of these women were from rural villages, living simple lives before the war tore through their communities. They had no weapons, no defenses, and no way of escaping the horrors that were inflicted upon them. Let's pause for a moment to consider the human stories behind these atrocities. Imagine being a young woman, no older than 18, living in a small, peaceful village in the Vietnamese countryside. The war is a distant rumble, something you've heard about but haven't seen up close. Then one day, everything changes. U.S. soldiers storm your village, rounding up the women and children. There's confusion, fear, and panic. You hear screams, and before you know it, you're dragged from your home and thrown into a chaotic scene of violence and terror. For many women, this nightmare became their reality. Take the story of Pham Thai Than, a mother of 3 who was tortured and raped in front of her children by U.S. soldiers. Her screams echoed through the village, but there was no one to help her. Her children, terrified and helpless, were forced to witness the unimaginable cruelty inflicted upon their mother. After the soldiers left, Pham was never the same. The physical wounds healed, but the emotional scars were permanent. Her children grew up with the trauma of that day, haunted by the memory of what they saw. There's also the story of Nguyen Thai Lan, who was just 19 when her village was raided. She was captured, beaten, and sexually assaulted by multiple soldiers. After the attack, she was left for dead. But Lan survived, and years later, she would share her story in hopes of bringing attention to the suffering endured by women like her. "They treated us like animals," she recalled in a testimony decades later. "We were not human to them. We were just objects for their anger." These are not isolated incidents. They represent the experiences of thousands of Vietnamese women who suffered in silence, their stories largely untold in the broader narrative of the Vietnam War.